So thank you again for inviting me here, and it's a pleasure to speak with you. My topic for today is going to be about higher education. And I'm a professor of anthropological archaeology at IU South Bend. I grew up in the upper Midwest right about the time when the auto industry started collapsing. So you might say, my life has been in ruins. Oh, you got it. All right. But it does make me a perfect guide for a deep dig into the history of higher education in Elkhart County. I'm going to be reading some of this because it's not my specialty, but I thought it was a really interesting topic for this particular group. So that's what I'm going to, if I'm looking down, that's the reason it's happening more often. This is a story about booms and busts. This is a story about ghost colleges, about some scandals, some celebrations, and a community that realized early on that if you want to survive, you have to learn. So we'll focus on Elkhart County's educational ventures, the successes, the failures, the forgotten, and along the way we'll meet some visionary founders, some women breaking barriers, some pacifists, some industrialists, and everyday people who built schools where none existed. So this is an academic history in two senses. Both it's the research, but it's about the academics itself. It's a field guide to the learned and the lost and the left behind. And I have to start with not IU South Bend or Elkhart County itself, but it is important. If you're talking about the weather, you have to talk about the sun. So if you're talking about the academic history in this area, you have to mention the other university. That's Notre Dame. So we'll start at the beginning, and I realize it's outside of Elkhart County, which is my focus here, but you'll see why there's a really important connection. So when I'm talking to outsiders, and they often ask, like, why here? Why did a French priest in 1842 build a university in northern Indiana wilderness? The usual story credits Father Edward Sorin and his vision, but the real story actually has a lot more complexity to it. Notre Dame exists because the Potawatomi people and their leader, Leopold Pokagon, in 1830s, he realized that the U.S. government was pushing native peoples westward, and the Pokagons negotiated to keep his band in the St. Joseph River Valley. So basically he said, if you send us your priests, we will give you land. And he wanted protection from what he called the Black Robes. So as a result, 524 acres was set aside for a mission that originally was going to educate Native American youths. This is the very land where Sorin built Notre Dame. So Sorin himself wasn't really breaking or trekking into unclaimed territory. He was walking into a relationship that was brokered by indigenous diplomacy. And this founding story for Notre Dame sets the stage for our region here. From the start, higher education was intertwined with issues of land and culture and the people who get to invite learning in. Notre Dame grew into an educational giant next door, but as we'll see, Elkhart's own educational ventures took a very different path. So, moving from South Bend then to Elkhart County, why is the county's liberal arts college in Goshen instead of in the larger city of Elkhart? The answer comes from a fateful decision back in 1903 that the locals might still talk about as the Great Divorce. In 1894, there was a group of Mennonite leaders who founded the Elkhart Institute of Science, Industry, and the Arts right here in Elkhart on Prairie Street. It was essentially a prep school aimed at helping farm kids prepare for the modern world, and by the turn of the century, it was really growing. And come 1903, the Institute needed to expand. It needed more land. Naturally, you'd think they'd grow in Elkhart, the city where they were prospering. And the city was great itself. It had the opera house and the theaters and the railroad industry and a very lively downtown. But the administration made a radical choice. They picked up the entire school and moved it out of the city over to a quiet cornfield in Goshen. Thus, the Elkhart Institute became the Goshen College in 1903. And why did it relocate? Officially, Goshen offered a better financial package, but unofficially, let's just say that Elkhart was too much fun for the Mennonites. Elkhart was an industrial railroad town. It had the Opera House. It had saloons. It was a much more worldly atmosphere than the church elders preferred. So the Mennonite Board of Education feared the quote-unquote moral corruption of the industrial city, and it might taint their younger students. So the quieter, drier Goshen, 10 miles down the road, seemed a safe place for shaping minds. So Elkhart lost its burgeoning college, and the decision did cast a very long shadow. Elkhart became a city of making things when Goshen became a city of studying things as well as growing things. For the next century, Elkhart's identity tilted more towards factories and the industrial world and practical skills, and Goshen became a quiet little college town. There was a cultural fallout, too, where the differing values between industrial people in Elkhart, the sort of patriotism here, and Goshen College pacifist ideals caused some friction for decades. And during World War I, Goshen College's Mennonite leaders refused to fly the American flag. So they didn't also support war bonds. So many factory workers here in Elkhart and veterans in Elkhart saw that stance as unpatriotic. To many factory workers, they decided to sort of storm into Goshen, and it turns out they actually painted the administration building yellow as a sign of cowardice. Goshen College even shut down for a single year from 1923 to 1924 because of all of this stuff and helping tempers cool. This standoff over values lasted until basically recently. I even remember the 2010 when the Goshen College finally played the national anthem, although they played a musical version of it rather than singing. So that's even a big change. It's all about education. Higher education here isn't just about books, it's about whose values get amplified. Ironically, while Elkhart didn't keep its undergraduate college, it did become a hub for theological education later on. If you drive down Benham Avenue on the south side of Elkhart, you might see a campus over there that some of you probably know what it is, others might not know what this is. This is the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. I'm going to say ABMS from now on. It was founded in 1958 by merging Goshen College's Religion Department Seminary with a seminary that moved here all the way from Chicago. So AMBS is a graduate school granting master's degrees in theology. For decades, it made Elkhart something kind of unlikely, the intellectual capital of Mennonite church globally. People from Africa and Europe and across the Americas came to study peace theology in Elkhart. So this is tucked in a modest neighborhood, but AMBS quietly grew the city into sort of a world exporter of religious scholarship. And AMBS isn't the only educational gem. I also want to resurrect the memory of Beulah College. This is another Elkhart institution people have forgotten. Before Mishawaka's Bethel College, now Bethel University, became the flagship for the missionary church, the missionary church ran a training school here in Elkhart called Beulah College in the early 1900s. If you felt a call to be a missionary in Africa or Asia, you likely spent time at Beulah. It wasn't a traditional college, it was a Bible institute, and it was a really interesting one compared to what they do in Bethel now, because you may have lived in a revival campground on the south side of Elkhart. You may have attended classes in scripture and evangelism and lit by lanterns. So Beulah eventually closed as the missionary church consolidated their education over in Mishawaka in the 1940s. But for a while, Elkhart was a two-seminary town. Mennonites studying at AMBS on one side and the missionary church evangelists training at Beulah on the other side. So the area, Notre Dame again is the Catholic school, but this area had an outsized share of theological brain power for a county much more known for manufacturing or cornfields. Interestingly, Beulah and AMBS brought women and international students into this area, so they became training work for those folks who were preparing to serve abroad. Now, a couple of other universities or institutions that no longer exist. The Northern Indiana University has always been sort of played about, and it becomes kind of a ghost college. It never really existed, but people have talked about it like it has. There was a proposal in the 1870s through the 1890s, and it was incredibly ambitious, even though it failed, to establish a major university in the region. And Elkhart was a serious contender. Civic leaders in Elkhart and Goshen and LaPorte and Plymouth and Fort Wayne all vied to host a comprehensive institution that would include a normal school, teacher education, as well as a commercial school and preparatory academies and so on. Elkhart's pitch was really strong. It offered Central Railroad access. It had industrial backing. There was even a growing commercial district that was eager to host a college town. But the movement fractured because all of the different towns competed against each other instead of uniting behind one single site. Elkhart's city council ultimately refused to match the land grant incentives that were offered elsewhere. So Northern Indiana University did grow, it's just not here. It became Valparaiso University. It opened in 1873 as the Northern Indiana Normal School and then evolved into Valparaiso University. So Elkhart came within a very narrow margin of becoming home to one of Indiana's major private universities. Then in the mid-20th century, Elkhart still didn't have a big liberal arts college, but it became a fertile ground for commercial and vocational schools. So because of the manufacturing groups in the area, we have one person that many of you know. This is Charles E. Kahn. He established the Kahn Conservatory of Music in Elkhart in the 1890s to train musicians and music teachers and promote, of course, instrument sales. So it functioned as a post-secondary music institute. It drew students from regionally and was very much built on a model that existed in Chicago at the time. Ultimately, it lost its famous instructors. The faculty couldn't afford to stay here, and there was a downturn in the economy in 1897, and it led to the closing of the Kahn Conservatory in 1903. Or there's Elkhart University. Now, Elkhart University is the private Elkhart Business University that was founded in 1882, and it later became the Elkhart University of Medical and Dental Technique. Despite the very grand name, it was essentially a career training school. It wasn't a fly-by-night operation, however. It was well respected in its field. In the mid-20th century, Elkhart University was famous for recruiting young women into the area from all around the Midwest to train and learn cutting-edge medical and office skills. Their brothers might have been building band instruments or working in the farms or eventually building the RVs, but these women were learning to operate x-ray machines and manage dental offices. So they lived in boarding houses on Main Street, and they donned very crisp uniforms, and they received a rigorous technical education. For roughly a century, Elkhart University provided a city with a private, secular technical college. It closed in 1986, ultimately a peaceful closure. It was death by market forces because other ventures, like Ivy Tech, took over the role. So here we have another ghost college. Elkhart's vocational history isn't all about institutions that vanished, however. Some simply transformed. In 1899 to 1933, the local hospital had its own school of nursing. So it was training young women on site. Back then, formal nursing degrees at universities were basically non-existent, and instead these, quote, women in white trained at the hospitals. They worked 12-hour shifts, they tended patients, and then they took classes after that. It was brutal, practical training, but it produced generations of very skilled nurses. And it's a poignant reminder that when we picture higher education, we might think of men in tweed jackets in lecture halls. But in the early 20th century, at least here in Elkhart, some of the most rigorous training was happening in hospital wards led by women and for women. All right, now to my university. So up to the mid-20th century, public higher education in our region was literally on the move. Before IU South Bend became a proper campus, higher learning lived in borrowed spaces and on the rails. So let's step back a moment into the early 1900s and imagine life as a IU extension student or a professor in the nomadic era. Beginning in 1912, IU in Bloomington created an extension division to reach Hoosiers who couldn't go down to the main campus. So instead of constructing new buildings at first, they sent out circuit riding professors. They would travel throughout the state. Picture this. It's 1925. You're an IU professor of political science. On Mondays, you lecture in Bloomington. On Tuesdays, you catch the train to Indianapolis. On Wednesday, you take the interurban rail to Fort Wayne and then to South Bend. On Thursday evening, you teach a class on American government in a mostly empty classroom in Elkhart High School. And on Friday, you gather all of your assignments and take the train back home, grading papers along the way. This is the fondly remembered flying squadron of professors. This was a stopgap system. It worked more or less well until history intervened in a very big way. World War II ended in 1945, and with the peace came the GI Bill. Thousands of servicemen and some servicewomen returned to this region, Elkhart County, armed with educational benefits at promise of college education. So suddenly this trickle of kind of rail riding professors and night students became a flood. By the late 1940s, the flying professors simply couldn't keep up. So this huge demand from veterans forced IU and the state leaders in the capital to realize that the region did need a campus of its own. So the pressure led to establishing a permanent IU extension centers. In 1961, IU South Bend had a dedicated building. But notably, Elkhart did not. In the 60s, or the 70s, or the 80s, or the 90s, and so on. So it took a lot of determination by locals later on to finally establish an IU South Bend presence in Elkhart. But before we get to that triumph, let's look at another side of post-war education, the rise of the community colleges and the technical institutes that would profoundly change Elkhart County's educational landscape. Parallel to the IU extensions, Indiana made another big move in the 1960s. It founded a new statewide system for vocational training. In 1963, Ivy Tech, which was originally Indiana Vocational Technical College, or IV Tech, it was created with a very straightforward mission: train Indiana's workforce. For Elkhart and for South Bend, this meant classes on welding and machining and drafting and so on, often held in borrowed industrial spaces. So for decades, Ivy Tech was seen as the sort of practical cousin to the traditional colleges. There was no frills, there were no dorms. You get your certificate, you get your skills, you go back. But an important shift came in 2005 when the state elevated Ivy Tech to a full community college status. That meant you could earn credits that you could then transfer to the full university, and this was a quiet revolution for Indiana education. Suddenly, Ivy Tech wasn't just teaching you how to repair engines, it taught you freshman English and algebra on a budget. And it paved a pathway to 4-year, or as it's now known, 4 or 5-year degrees. So what was once considered just kind of vo-tech became an integral part of higher education here, serving thousands of local students. And I do want to make a quick sidetrack. Higher education does not just happen in schools. For much of the 20th century, Elkhart had a de facto university operating within a corporation. This is Miles Laboratory. You might know Miles as the company behind Alka-Seltzer and One a Day and so on. And right next to me is one of the Miles' daughter marrying into the Beardsley family. So it was founded in Elkhart in the 1880s, and it grew into a pharma and consumer health giant. And because we didn't have any local colleges producing more advanced scientists, Miles actually imported PhDs from top schools around the country and the world. So this presence of sort of brain imports, the opposite of a brain drain, led the blue-collar town to have a very important ripple effects. These scientists and these professionals got involved in the community. They served on local school boards. They supported the arts. They funded scholarships for local use. So in effect, Miles became sort of a private endowment for Elkhart. It did put some intellectual and financial capital into the city. So you don't need a campus quadrangle to have an intellectual ecosystem. Sometimes just a really good chemistry lab and a really well-funded corporate payroll will do that. Okay, so we've followed a thread of private, religious, and for-profit schools. So now let's return to the trajectory of a public university, namely Indiana University South Bend, and how Elkhart finally got its share of that public investment. So we saw how IU's extension classes met the local needs throughout the mid-century, and how IU South Bend's main campus emerged in the 1960s. But for Elkhart residents, attending IU still meant commuting to South Bend or settling for night classes here in town. And there are a few reasons for this delay. One was a lingering local suspicion. Recall that in the 1950s, some conservative voices in Elkhart weren't too keen on a state university presence. This is during the Cold War and a Red Scare mentality. And business leaders and a local John Birch society fretted about liberal professors coming into town. And funding for a public university felt like kind of accepting those radical ideas. I'm an anthropologist. I'm going to say that this is kind of like history repeating itself, because if you have paid attention to the state capitol in the last 2 years, you see the same fears exist. So the same thing happening now happened here in the 1950s. In the 1980s and the 1990s, a lack of an IU campus became sort of an embarrassment in Elkhart. Especially galling was the fact that for many years, IUSB's Elkhart Center operated out of what building? Anybody remember? So it was out of the old Pepsi bottling plant? Yeah, on Main Street in Elkhart. IU classes were literally held in a renovated soda pop factory, sticky floors, and the faint smell of syrup on hot days. I learned both the sound of the industrial HVAC drowned out lectures, and students joke that they got a quote-unquote pop quiz. That one's not my joke. And a whiff of cola at the same time. So finally, Elkhart decided it had enough of being the poor relation. And in the mid-2000s came one of the greatest local triumphs, the building of the IU South Bend Elkhart Center in downtown Elkhart. What's extraordinary is how it was funded. The state of Indiana repeatedly dragged its feet on paying for a new building, so Elkhart's community raised the money itself. So this was spearheaded by the Community Foundation and philanthropical citizens, notably local legend Art Decio and others. You all pulled together $5 million in private donations to construct a public university facility. But because of that, you got to put it where you wanted. And instead of being out by the toll road or someplace more convenient for commuters and so on, it opened in 2007 on Franklin Street, right in downtown Elkhart. The community wanted the campus to spark a downtown renovation, and it did. Elkhart Center is integrated right into the heart of the city, and it's an anchor for the neighborhood, along with the learner and everything else happening in that area. So when it opened, it was actually one of the most advanced IU regional campus buildings in the state. We over at the regular South Bend campus were kind of jealous because you had really cool technology and really nice desks. So this is a story of civic pride and perseverance. After being overlooked and underserved for so long, Elkhart took control of its own educational destiny. And this should remind you then of earlier eras. Just as the Waukegan bargained for Notre Dame to protect its own people, and just as the Mennonites brought the seminaries here, and just as entrepreneurs opened up for-profit colleges and technical schools here, the people of Elkhart said education is vital. We'll invest in it ourselves if we must. Very, very quickly, because of time, I'm just going to briefly hit on this particular slide. I just wanted to, because it's not as much history as what's currently happening. So Goshen, the small group that left our big city because it was so afraid of the worldliness, is actually now a Hispanic serving institution. It is actively recruiting Hispanic students and getting federal money to do so. We began with the Potawatomi, and let's also note that Notre Dame has started programs to honor Native history, and IU South Bend offered scholarship to Native students to recruit them in as well. So when we look back at roughly 180 years of higher education in Elkhart County, what do we see? We see piety, we see industry, and we see resilience. Religious institutions gave birth to many of the institutions here. Elkhart tied learning to making a living, and above all, the community repeatedly reinvented how it learned in order to meet its own needs. When one model didn't fit, they tried another. When the official channels failed, locals found workarounds. So Elkhart has been making its own educational destiny since then. Now, finally, as an anthropologist, I'll end with this. Cultures survive by adapting. And the people of Elkhart County understood that knowledge isn't bestowed, it's pursued. They adapted every time the world changed. They ensured that education was always available to the next generation. So thank you very much for listening. If you pass an old building or see the name of a defunct college, remember every one of those places was people striving to better themselves and better their community. And that striving is the true legacy over here in Elkhart. Thank you very much.